Dark tourism is usually defined as tourism which involves travelling to places associated with tragedy or death. But do such visits qualify as being educational, or are they simply a case of people indulging in the macabre? Despite seemingly a modern phenomenon, dark tourism actually has a long history, with in centuries past people travelling far and wide to view public executions or watch gladiators in combat. From a disaster-stricken ancient town to a historic morbid memorial, here are my choices for 5 of the most disturbing and dark tourist destinations on Earth. Number 5. Oradour-sur-Glane. Nestled in the idyllic countryside of central France, the sleepy town of Oradour-sur-Glane had managed to largely escape the ravages of the Second World War, which was engulfing Europe. However, on June 10, 1944, the horrors of war would finally rain down upon the town's inhabitants. Just days earlier, the D-Day landings in Normandy had begun, as Allied forces poured into northern France in an attempt to liberate the country and help end the war once and for all. Energized by the landings, French resistance fighters stepped up their operations against the occupying German army in the hopes of hampering the German defense. Yet for the elite 2nd SS Panzer Division, stationed in southern France, such partisan attacks were usually little more than an annoyance, but nevertheless an annoyance which they dealt with ruthlessly. While heading north to help defend against the Allied advance, one of the division's unit commanders was met by French collaborators who informed him that an SS officer was being held captive by resistance fighters in a nearby town called Oradour-sur-Glane. An SS battalion under the command of Major Adolf Diekmann was dispatched to the village with orders to take 30 people as hostages and use them to barter with the resistance fighters for the release of the captive SS officer. Major Diekmann had other ideas, however. On the 10th of June 1944, his battalion surrounded the town and ordered all residents to assemble in the village square to have their identity papers examined. Believing that this was just a routine check, the villagers agreed. However, according to eyewitness accounts, the women and children were quickly separated from the men and locked in the church, while the men were taken to a group of 6 barns and sheds where Diekmann's men had machine guns set up and ready. Once the men were inside the sheds and barns, the SS opened fire, deliberately aiming at the men's legs so as to disable them without killing them. Alive but unable to move, 190 wounded men were then burned alive as the SS soldiers set ablaze the barns, with just 5 of the town's men managing to get away from the massacre under cover of darkness. Meanwhile, a thorough search of the village was taking place, as anyone who might have tried to hide themselves away was mercilessly hunted down. One elderly disabled man was burnt to death in the bed where he was found, while others were killed and then thrown down the town's well. There are even reports that one family was baked to death in the local bakery ovens, among several other brutal and horrific murders. With the men dead and the town cleared and looted, the time came to deal with the terrified women and children locked in the church. The SS men proceeded to set fire to the church, shooting anyone who attempted to escape through the windows. In all, 247 women and 205 children died in the flames. The entire village was razed as the marauding SS soldiers set fire to houses and cars and stole anything that might hold any value. The crime was so staggering that even Diekmann's superior was shocked by his actions and began his own investigation into the massacre. However, the investigation was quickly suspended after Diekmann and many of the men who took part in the massacre were killed shortly afterwards during the Battle of Normandy. After the war had ended, survivors of the SS unit that took part in the massacre were hunted down. However, justice was never served as many of the men were living in communist-controlled East Germany, which would not allow their extradition to France. It was also discovered that 14 of the men charged were actually French citizens who claimed that they had been forced to join the SS after the Germans captured their home region of Alsace. These men were granted amnesty by the French government, and by 1958, all of the German suspects had also been released. Today the town stands just as it did on that fateful day, virtually undisturbed after it was decided that the village should not be rebuilt and instead be left as it was, to serve as a memorial to the 642 people who were murdered here. Each year 300,000 visitors walk its ruined streets, observing the husks of the burnt-out, decaying buildings and the scattered few remaining possessions of its former inhabitants, which includes the rusting car of the town's former mayor. The few changes to the town made in recent years include a memorial museum, which holds items recovered from the burnt-out church and barns, such as watches which stopped at the time their owners were burnt alive, and a plain sign above the entrance to the village which simply reads, "Remember." Number 4. The ruins of Pompeii. Located near modern-day Naples, the ancient Roman town of Pompeii was once a bustling centre of commerce. The town's scenic location near Mount Vesuvius made it a popular vacation spot for Roman aristocracy, and the area was lined with elaborately decorated villas and even boasted a hotel. However, it was this close proximity to Mount Vesuvius that would eventually lead to the town being wiped off the map. The residents of Pompeii had become almost desensitized to earthquakes and strange volcanic activity, as minor quakes and tremors had become commonplace, yet this complacency would ultimately lead to disaster. On the 5th of February 62 AD, a severe earthquake gave the residents of Pompeii a taste of the destruction nature could unleash at a moment's notice. Large sections of the town were damaged or outright destroyed, and hundreds or even thousands are thought to have perished in the chaos. In fact, the damage caused by this earthquake was so bad that large numbers of people permanently abandoned the settlement. Yet despite this disaster, the remaining citizens set to work repairing their homes. Little did they know that their efforts would be for nothing, for far worse was looming on the horizon. Just a few years later, in 79 AD, calamity struck. One day after the Roman festival of the god of fire, nature's very own firestorm would be unleashed as Mount Vesuvius erupted. A huge explosion on the morning of the 24th of August signaled to Pompeii's 11,000 residents that something was wrong, yet it's likely that most citizens would have carried on with their lives in the false belief that this was just another minor disturbance. By the afternoon, a second and even greater explosion would have likely caused panic as a giant cloud of gas, rocks and dust burst 27 miles into the sky before violently raining down upon Pompeii. People began seeking shelter in their homes in a desperate attempt to protect themselves from the volcanic material raining down upon them. Yet in just a few hours, it's thought that Pompeii and its people were buried in a mixture of ash and rock that reached as much as 25 meters deep. A nearby Roman admiral stationed across the bay attempted to launch a heroic evacuation, but just hours later he too would be dead, choking on the poisonous and suffocating mixture of gas, rocks and ash that had now claimed the town. Buildings began collapsing under the enormous weight of ash that had settled on the roof, crushing those sheltering inside, and sometime during the night a superheated cloud of gas and ash engulfed the town, baking alive anyone who had managed to survive this long. Seeing the folly of remaining indoors only to be buried alive, some had made a break for it, strapping pillows to their heads in an effort to protect themselves against the falling rocks, yet it's thought that as many as 2,000 people were killed. By the time the eruption had ended, Pompeii was completely buried, sealed in a tomb of volcanic ash where it would remain frozen in time for hundreds of years until finally being rediscovered in 1748. Despite the passing of time, the town was eerily well preserved and provided a ghostly snapshot of ancient Roman life. Houses, villas, and even artwork and graffiti were unearthed from the dust virtually intact, giving us a glimpse of what life was like in the city right before it was buried nearly 2,000 years ago. Yet perhaps the most disturbing sight any visitor to Pompeii encounters are the plaster casts of those who died here. Excavators were shocked to discover human remains tucked inside the hollowed-out pockets their bodies had created inside the tightly packed ash. By filling in these voids with plaster, they were able to capture lifelike casts of the position people were in at the moment of death, trapping what remained of their skeletons inside the lifeless casts. The final result are chilling reproductions of the individual's last moments, and many are so precise that they capture small details such as hairstyles and clothes, with some even capturing the expression on the face of their subject. Families huddled together inside their homes, and individuals caught out in the open have all been immortalized with this morbid technique and are on full display for curious visitors to observe and photograph. Scans of the human remains have revealed that over 1/3 suffered severe head injuries, either through the roofs of their homes collapsing or from falling rocks and stones from the eruption, with the rest dying from asphyxiation or being baked alive in the 300-degree clouds of superheated gas, the intense heat causing their lifeless bodies to twist and contort into positions that make them appear as though they are fixed in agony. With over 3.5 million people visiting the site every year, it's likely that the name Pompeii will forever be associated with deadly disaster. Number 3. The Skull Tower. A tower embedded with human skulls might seem like an unusual example of a national monument. However, the story behind the Skull Tower in Serbia is what gives it such a revered status, attracting as many as 50,000 tourists per year. In 1801, Serbia had been under Ottoman rule for over 300 years. However, rebellion would soon be in the air. A group of elite Ottoman soldiers known as the Janissaries murdered the local commander of the Belgrade province in an attempt to break away from the empire and rule independently from the Sultan. At that time, the Serbian people had received relatively fair treatment from the Sultan. However, the Janissaries, who had now seized power, implemented a far more tyrannical regime. Taxes were raised, forced labour was imposed, and in 1804, fearing that the Sultan might use the Serbs to help him take back control of the province, the Janissaries launched what they viewed as a preemptive strike, slaughtering hundreds of Serbian chieftains in an effort to squash any potential resistance, placing their severed heads on public display as an example to any who might dare defy their power. Yet this act of slaughter had the opposite effect, and the now enraged Serbian people began murdering the village overseers, entering open rebellion against their new Janissary overlords. A rebel army was raised under the leadership of George Petrovic, which quickly liberated towns throughout the province. Although the Serbs were technically fighting on the same side as the Ottoman Empire against the renegade Janissaries, the Ottoman Sultan feared the Serb army's power, believing that once the Janissary rebellion had been squashed, the Serbs might turn on him and demand independence from the empire. The Sultan ordered the Serb army to immediately disband. However, since many towns were still under Janissary control, they refused. In response, the Sultan sent his forces to crush all Serb resistance. The first Serbian uprising had begun. Initially, the Serbs won several victories against the Sultan, establishing their own government, reducing taxes, and abolishing forced labour. However, the winning streak would not last. Serbian rebels had built trenches and fortifications around the strategically important city of Niš, which barred Ottoman entry into the rest of Serbia and was therefore a prime target for attack. On the 31st of May 1809, the long-dreaded attack came. Outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements, it seemed as if defeat was imminent. However, one after another, 5 separate Ottoman attacks were repulsed, each wave of men crashing against the trenches, only to be cut down by the defending Serbs, inflicting thousands of casualties. Yet by attack number 6, they finally broke through the Serb defences and poured into the trenches, where combat descended into brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Bayonets, knives, and bare hands were the weapons of choice as the two sides struggled for dominance. The Serbian commander Stevan Sinjelic saw that the fight could no longer be won, as the attacking Ottomans were rapidly taking over control of his trench. Knowing that he and his men would be impaled should they be captured, he decided on one final act of defiance. As the victorious Ottoman soldiers approached him, he fired his pistol into a pile of gunpowder kegs, causing a giant explosion which killed everyone in and around the trench, friend and foe alike. The furious Ottoman commander ordered that the dead rebels be decapitated, the skin peeled from their heads, and each head then stuffed with straw before being sent back to the Sultan as proof of victory. The rebel skulls were then returned to Niš, where they were used to create a giant skull tower on the road to Constantinople as a warning of the fate that awaited anyone who might dare defy the might of the empire. 952 of the skulls were embedded into the 4 sides of the Macabre Tower, which rose to a height of 15 feet, but in the following years, many of the 952 skulls were taken by relatives of those who had died in an effort to give them a proper burial, while others were simply stolen by souvenir hunters. Despite the tower being designed to intimidate, the plan seems to have backfired, and it instead created resentment and served as a visible reminder for locals of the empire's potential for cruelty. In fact, it proved to be so counterproductive that the last Ottoman governor of Niš ordered the skulls to be removed in the early 1860s, and following the complete Ottoman withdrawal from Serbia in 1878, the Serbian army searched the town for the skulls which had been removed, burying many of them and constructing a chapel around the tower, which has now become a symbol of the country's long and bloody struggle for independence. 54 skulls still remain embedded in the tower to this day, with the skull believed to belong to Sinjelic, the commander who sacrificed himself by detonating the powder magazine, prominently displayed encased in a glass container, so that all visitors to the tower can pay their respects to the fallen hero. Number 2. Hiroshima. In the final year of the Second World War, Germany had been defeated, but the difficult task of forcing a Japanese surrender still lay ahead. With the emperor vowing to fight to the bitter end, A costly and bloody invasion of the Japanese mainland loomed on the horizon, a campaign which military leaders estimated might inflict as many as 1 million Allied casualties. It was against this backdrop that the US won the race to develop the first atomic bomb, a weapon which they intended to put to deadly use in the hopes that it would finally force a Japanese surrender and ultimately spare hundreds of thousands of lives. With Allied demands for an unconditional Japanese surrender being ignored, plans to use the weapons were drawn up, and a short list of potential targets was created. A number of cities were considered, however Hiroshima was chosen because it was a large industrial centre and housed 40,000 military personnel who were part of the army tasked with the defence of the entirety of southern Japan. It was also relatively untouched by air raids, and so was ideal for testing the damage potential of the A-bomb. Nearby hills were also deemed to be likely to focus the force of the blast, and thus increase the total damage inflicted, and the majority of buildings and factories were constructed with timber, making the entire city highly susceptible to the firestorm the bomb would unleash. When the bomb was finally dropped on the 6th of August, around 340,000 people were living in Hiroshima. By the end of the day, 70,000 would be dead, with tens of thousands more suffering severe injuries. The blast and subsequent firestorm destroyed over 70% of the city's buildings, with a massive 5 square miles of previously densely populated land reduced to smouldering ruins. Survivors recalled seeing a blinding flash, followed by a deafening booming sound, signalling the destruction of their city. Those caught out in the open were killed instantly, and the eerie phenomenon of what has since become known as the Hiroshima Shadows scarred the city. These shadows were created by a victim's body, shielding the floor or wall from the radiation of the blast, leaving behind a ghostly black shadow where they once stood. Similar shadows from window frames, railings, and even bicycles were also found, demonstrating just how bright and intense the original blast would have been. By the time the dust had settled, Hiroshima was reduced to a barren wasteland, bearing no resemblance to its former glory. The Japanese Second General Army stationed in the city was decimated, with 3,243 soldiers out in the open, conducting training on the parade ground, killed instantly, and any military personnel who survived were quickly utilised in rescue operations, leading to the unusual sight of suicide boats which were being ready to defend against the American invasion, instead put to use saving lives, collecting the wounded and ferrying them to hospital. Despite these efforts, as many as 20,000 soldiers were killed. However, the majority of casualties were civilians, including 20,000 Korean slave labourers who were being held in the city. Despite the devastation, the Japanese government still refused to surrender, believing that the US held no more than another 1 or 2 bombs. The decision was made to endure more attacks until the US stockpile of bombs was exhausted, and continue fighting the war. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing at least 40,000 more, and the US began to make plans to ready a third bomb for use later that month, with 3 more in September and an additional 3 in October. Further attacks would not be needed, however, as 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, the Japanese announced their surrender. While it's generally believed that the bombs forced the Japanese surrender and saved hundreds of thousands of lives, some point to the Soviet Union entering the war against Japan as being the deciding factor in the decision to surrender. There is also the theory of atomic diplomacy, the idea that the US used the bombs as a way to intimidate the Soviet Union during the early stages of what would become the Cold War, and that ending the war against Japan was in fact just a cover story. Such debates over the ethics of the bombings will continue. However, today the area near the blast site has been converted into a memorial park, which includes the ruins of one of the few buildings to survive, now referred to as the A-bomb Dome, which has since been made a UNESCO World Heritage Site and has been preserved in memory of those who died. The dome miraculously survived the incredible power of the blast due to its vertical columns resisting much of the downward force from the explosion. The park itself contains several other memorials and museums and attracts over 1 million visitors every year, with some of the memorials containing over 300,000 names of those who were affected by the bomb. Despite the city now being completely rebuilt, the scars of the past will forever remain, and the very name Hiroshima is likely to forever be a byword for the horrors of nuclear warfare. Number 1. Security Prison 21. Amongst the urban sprawl of Cambodia's capital city lies the infamous Security Prison 21. While on the outside this former high school looks like an ordinary and even drab part of the city's landscape, Its interior was the site of terrible atrocities committed by the insane and murderous Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge regime, and today serves as a genocide museum and memorial to Cambodia's darkest chapter. In August of 1976, the high school's 5 buildings were taken over by the Khmer Rouge, and the former place of learning became a prison, torture chamber, and execution centre that would claim as many as 20,000 lives. Following the Khmer Rouge victory in the Cambodian Civil War, Pol Pot embarked upon his grand vision to return the nation to what he referred to as Year Zero, a classless society of farmers which shunned intellectuals, foreign influence, and the modern world itself. In order to achieve this goal, millions of Cambodians who might stand in his way, or simply did not fit into his ideal for what the perfect society should look like, would need to be eliminated. Security Prison 21 was just one of as many as 150 execution centres located across the country, and by the time Pol Pot was finally deposed, as many as 2 million people would be dead, which accounted for an incredible 25% of the country's entire population. Soldiers and officials of the previous government, academics and intellectuals, doctors, teachers, and even monks would all be subject to arrest, torture and interrogation, and summary execution in the regime's bloody quest to purify the population. As Pol Pot became more paranoid, even his own supporters would not escape the carnage. He launched brutal purges of his own party, and thousands of loyal followers and their families, as well as anyone he considered a potential rival, would perish in the same prisons and killing fields as those they had previously condemned. For those unfortunate souls who found themselves interred inside Security Prison 21, death would not come quickly. After the school was taken over, it was quickly adapted into a makeshift prison and interrogation centre. Electrified barbed wire surrounded the site, and classrooms were converted into tiny prison cells, interrogation rooms, or dedicated torture chambers, which processed as many as 1,500 captives at any given time. Life for inmates was depressingly grim, and seems to have been sadistically designed to inflict as much pain and suffering as possible before prisoners were finally murdered. The goal of the prison, and others like it, was not only to eliminate entire swathes of the population, but to first torture them into confessing to imaginary crimes, and to then implicate family members and friends, who would in turn find themselves suffering the same fate. Those deemed to be incompatible with the goals of Year Zero would be arrested and taken to the prison, where they would first be photographed and meticulously interviewed about their entire life history, before being stripped and sent to one of the tiny cells, often shackled to the floor, and forced to sleep without mats, blankets, or mosquito nets. Discussions amongst inmates was strictly forbidden, and any violation of the numerous strict regulations would be met with a severe beating. Fed just 4 small spoons of rice porridge with a watery soup twice a day, the starvation rations and unhygienic environment caused diseases and illnesses to rapidly spread amongst the prisoners. Food and medical treatment existed simply to prolong an inmate's life long enough for the confession to be signed, and even ending your own life was not an option, as anything that could be used to inflict self-injury had been confiscated. Within just days of arrival, the interrogations would begin. Beatings, electric shocks, and waterboarding were all used to encourage prisoners to confess, along with more primitive tortures such as burnings, suffocation, cutting the flesh with knives, and even removing fingernails and toenails before pouring alcohol on the open wounds. Simply killing the prisoner was strictly forbidden. The guards needed to obtain the treasured confession before death could be granted, in a bizarre and insane attempt at giving the atrocities some kind of veneer of legality. Once the prisoner had finally succumbed to the pain and told the interrogators whatever they wanted to hear, they would then be transported to a nearby killing field where they would be murdered with makeshift weapons like iron rods and pickaxes to save money on bullets, and then buried in a mass grave with their fellow victims. The madness finally came to an end in 1979 when the invading Vietnamese army captured the prison and discovered the horrors held within. In 1980 it was reopened as a museum and a memorial to the victims of the genocide, and today visitors can see the interior, which has been left almost untouched. Torture implements used to extract confessions from the innocent are displayed throughout the museum, while photographs of the thousands of people who suffered here line its walls. The tiny cells and grim torture chambers are eerily well preserved, and a grisly map of Cambodia, constructed from human skulls and bones, forms a centerpiece of the memorial, and symbolises the unimaginable numbers of dead who suffered at the hands of Pol Pot and his regime. In fact, of the estimated 20,000 people held captive in just this one prison, only 7 are known to have survived, kept alive because their skills as mechanics or artists were deemed to be valuable by the prison commander. Now an important educational site and memorial, Security Prison 21 serves as a grim reminder of the crimes committed by the Khmer Rouge, ensuring that those who perished here and at other sites across Cambodia are never forgotten. So those are my choices for 5 of the most disturbing and dark tourist destinations. Let me know which other places you would have included in the list in the comments below, and I'll see you again on the next video.